all about estimating in Agile. But before we get into the actual Agile piece, I think we first need to start out with explaining what estimating is. So estimating is the concept of roughly calculating. And in this particular case, we're roughly calculating how long it's going to take us to complete a particular user story. How long it's going to take for us to get from beginning to done. Now, that roughly calculating thing, I don't know, calculating to me sounds a lot like you have all the information and you're just kind of putting it together or figuring things out like a math problem. But to me, estimation is nothing like a calculation. It's more of a guess. But it's not just a wild guess, it's actually an educated guess. You're using some information to help you come up with your best educated guess on how long this is going to take. Now, the information you use, there's really three key pieces to it. Number one, which is the most important, is the elicited information. So this is the information you've gathered from stakeholders. This is their various needs. This is their wants. This is ultimately what put together the core of that particular user story. So that obviously, based on what they tell you there, will dictate how long it's going to take you to actually solve that with some type of solution. Secondly, you want to utilize your past experiences. So this could be experiences on other projects or other user stories that are similar to this, where now you can utilize the lessons learned from that past user story to actually help you create your best estimate for this user story. And finally, you can also use various documentation from your organization. So your organization may have some standards documentation for estimating. So some organizations are very mature in how they do it. Some organizations have some repetitive tasks. And so they have some various documents that will help their team members to put together an accurate, or as accurate as possible, estimate. So now that you understand what estimating is in general, let's move on and talk about estimating specifically for Agile. Now, before we get into the deeper topics of Scrum, we need to actually pivot and talk about estimating in Agile. Over the next few lectures, we're going to be detailing out estimating in Agile. We're going to cover what estimating is, why it's done, and some of the most common estimation techniques that are utilized for Agile projects. Where I want to start is actually not looking at Agile. I want to talk about estimating for non-Agile projects. And this will help to give you some context prior to jumping into the Agile side. So for non-Agile projects, this is more waterfall or iterative projects, you are going to get absolute estimates. What I mean by that is you've completed requirements and you've handed those requirements for that particular item or task or feature over to a developer. And now that developer is going to developer or solutioner, because it may not be like a software developer. But anyways, you hand it over to the person that's going to be completing that particular feature, and they're going to read through everything, and from a non-Agile standpoint, they're going to deliver back a number. So this is going to usually signify the number of days for the duration of that particular feature. I feel this particular feature is going to take me 3 days to complete. That would be an absolute estimate. You're giving a set number of days in this case for how long it's going to take to complete that particular feature. Agile is a little bit different. Agile looks at things relative to the other features, items, tasks that were estimated as part of that project. So Agile looks at it and says, is this a small, or is this a medium, or is this a large item? We don't care about specifically how long we feel it's going to take us. We just need to know, is it small, medium, or large? What bucket does it go into? And now when we say a relative estimate, the reason we say that is it's relative to the other items that have already been estimated as part of that project. So let's break that down a little further with an example. On the screen, you'll see a fly, a frog, and an elephant. The fly is small. The frog is medium. And the elephant is large. So as we're working through, if we were trying to categorize or bucket a whole bunch of animals,
we would use these as our relative sizing. If we find a rhinoceros, it's going to be a large. It's going to go with that elephant. If we find a butterfly, maybe that goes with the frog because it's the same size as the frog. Or maybe it's a really small butterfly and goes with the fly. So you can start to do the sizing or the estimating based on relativity to the other things that were already estimated. Now, the thing to recognize with the relative estimate is that relativity is really only inside of that project. So those team members are estimating tasks based on other tasks or features that were already estimated as part of that project. And so they're going to look to try to put it in that small, medium, or large bucket. But those buckets don't necessarily apply to every other project. Let's look at another one. So here we've got a ladybug, an elephant, and a tree. The ladybug here represents the small. The elephant is now a medium in this particular project, and the tree is a large. So as you can see, even though that elephant was a large estimated item as part of the previous project, that exact same item or requirement or feature could be estimated as a medium as part of a different project. It's all relative to the other items, the other tasks, the other features that are being estimated out. So it's a really important concept to grasp. So I hope that makes sense in regards to a relative estimate from an Agile standpoint to an absolute estimate in non-Agile. Personally, from an estimation standpoint, Agile is so much easier. It's so much easier to do a relative estimate than it is to do an absolute estimate for a couple reasons. One is you can just kind of place it in a bucket, comparing it to other things, rather than detailing out in your mind every step that you need to complete to then come up with an absolute estimate. So that's one big thing. And the other big thing is the third bullet points that I have listed here. In Agile, updates usually don't affect a whole lot in the project. They usually have a pretty minor effect. And what I mean by updates is an estimation update. So let's say we put it into a small bucket and it ends up turning into a medium-sized feature. Okay, well, it could hurt us in our sprint a little bit. We could maybe not get everything done that we wanted to get done, but it's okay. We can bump another thing out to the next sprint. From a non-Agile standpoint, it can have pretty dire consequences for a project. What I mean by that is, let's say it was estimated at 2 days, and then it actually took 4 days to complete. Well, that 2 extra days has to come from somewhere. And I guarantee on the plan, there were other features and items and tasks that were lined up to be completed after that. Well, now that that first one got pushed back, it has to cascade across all of those other tasks, moving them back or trying to find a way to make up that additional 2 days that was unaccounted for because of the incorrect or invalid estimate. Buckets based on various techniques, as you'll learn about in a future lecture. But that's the most obvious one. We're giving them the requirement. They're telling us an estimated duration. Now we can use that for our planning and moving forward on that particular feature, or deciding if, you know what, let's go ahead and table that. It's going to take a little bit longer than what we were expecting. The second thing that estimating does for you is it helps to drive out clarification questions. When you're asking somebody to commit something, you're asking them to commit an estimate for a particular task, they're going to spend a little bit extra time making sure that they read the feature, they read all those requirements, they read the acceptance criteria, and they have a good understanding of how they would go to accomplish this particular feature. Now, with doing that, they're going to also drive out additional clarification questions or unknowns that weren't defined there. So by asking for an estimate, not only are you going to potentially get a duration back, you also are going to get clarifying questions of things that you need to dig in further to and make sure that you have defined as part of the requirement prior to that requirement actually being able to be completed by that developer or the person creating that solution. So that's number 2. It helps to drive out clarifying questions. Number 3 is it highlights complex or high-risk tasks. As you're working in projects more and more, you get a sense of how long things take. And when you're writing your user stories, your features, you have an idea if this is a small, a medium, or a large type of task. Now, that's going to be really useful when you hand that to somebody that's going to be creating it, and then they give you an estimate back and they say, okay, I think this is a medium requirement or medium feature. You may say, Wait a minute, I was thinking it was a small, so let's talk through a little bit. What are some of the complexities? What are some of the risk items that made you consider it a medium? So it helps to bring conversation and highlight some of those complexities and risky issues that you may not have been aware of or accounted for. Now, by highlighting and by knowing that information, you can make adjustments. Maybe you tweak the requirements a little bit. Maybe you tweak that feature to make it less complex by taking very little away from it or changing it very little. Maybe you look to mitigate or remove those potential risks that were identified as part of that feature, and so then it can be reduced in size. Ultimately, the goal isn't to reduce the size, but it's to make sure that it's in line with expectations and with what would want to be done for the value that feature provides. So those are the big reasons why we estimate in Agile. Provides that estimated duration, drives out additional clarification questions, and can help to highlight or point out areas of complexity or high risk that were previously unidentified or unaccounted for. Some of the most common Agile estimation techniques. And the three that we're going to cover is the big, uncertain, small, also known as the bus. We have t-shirt sizes, and we have the Fibonacci sequence. We're going to start with the most simple one, the bus. The big, uncertain, small estimation technique has three buckets. You have a bucket for big user stories, you have a bucket for uncertain user stories, and you have a bucket for small user stories. All of the features, all of the items that are being estimated get placed into one of those three buckets. Ideally, you want as many features in the small bucket as possible. Those features are small and bite-sized and can be done in a relatively short amount of time. Now, with any of the stories that are in the big bucket, the first thing you should try to do is break them up. Is there a way that we can take that existing user story and break it up into multiple user stories, ultimately parse out that user story, and then have those be estimated at small? That way they're bite-sized, they're easy to complete and provide value. Not all big user stories can be broken up and still maintain the same amount of value delivered to the stakeholders or the users in this case. So some of them will stay big, but you do want to make an attempt to try to break up as many of those as possible. Any stories that are part of the uncertain bucket, that means that the requirements, the user stories are too vague. Maybe the concepts behind it are bleeding edge, and so it's really difficult to estimate how long it's going to take. These ones most definitely need to be broken up, defined and redefined, and then re-estimated to hopefully get them into either the big or the small buckets. So bus is a fairly simple agile estimation technique. The most often I see this utilized by companies that are just switching to Agile from a more predictive methodology such as waterfall. But you do see some organizations that use this if they want to keep their estimation concepts pretty small on their projects. Next, let's look at t-shirt sizes. This one has multiple buckets. You actually usually have 5 buckets as part of this. You have an extra small, a medium, a large, and an extra large. So those are the 5 buckets that the features can be estimated into, and they go along with relative t-shirt sizes. The reason I think t-shirts are used is because it's very global. Everybody understands what a size of a shirt is, regardless of what language they're in, what country they work for, or what project methodology they've used in the past. And so this one has also become a fairly popular estimation technique for organizations switching to Agile, but some of them even just stay on these t-shirt sizes. They don't need it more complex than that. So each user story obviously is compared to each other based on how long it's going to take. It's placed into the one of 5 buckets: extra small, medium, large, and extra large. The large and extra large user stories are the ones that you should look at and see if you can break them up, if possible, into smaller user stories, ones that would fit into that extra small or medium sized buckets. It's not always going to be possible, but highly recommended that you don't have many, if any, large or extra large stories as you move forward to begin some of your sprint planning. So that's the t-shirt sizes estimation technique. The last estimation technique that we're going to talk about is definitely the most complex, and that's the Fibonacci sequence. The Fibonacci sequence uses abstract values or abstract numbers to help put the user stories into buckets.
We interrupt your regularly scheduled video to further explain this concept. As we mentioned, this can be confusing at first, so we want to dive in a bit deeper. The Fibonacci sequence has the team grouping together their user stories into buckets. They're determining the groups by pulling together the user stories of approximately the same size of effort to complete. Okay, so we have these buckets. Let's call them A through G. So we have bucket A, bucket B, bucket C, D, E, F, and G. The A bucket represents the smallest effort user stories. The G bucket represents the largest effort user stories. So the team grabs a user story, analyzes and discusses the details, and then determines the appropriate bucket it would fit into. But with our current naming convention, it's hard to know the real difference between a lot of those middle buckets. Like, what's the real difference between buckets C and D, or buckets D and E? It's hard. So what we'll do instead is use a sequence of numbers called the Fibonacci sequence to name the buckets. So using the Fibonacci sequence, the first bucket is going to be 1. The second bucket will be 2. Now, the way the Fibonacci sequence works is you add together the 2 previous numbers to get the next one. So with that, our first bucket's 1, second bucket is 2. 1 plus 2 is 3. So the third bucket is 3. As we continue on following the same pattern, 2 and 3 makes 5. So the next bucket is 5. 3 and 5 is 8. 5 and 8 is 13. And 8 and 13 is 21. So now our bucket groupings are following that Fibonacci sequence. With the buckets being labeled with numbers, it's naturally easier for the team to group those user stories by similar size and to be able to tell apart those that were estimated at a medium-ish size. Well, I hope that helps to explain it. Back to your regularly scheduled video.
So the sequence goes like this: 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, etc. So those numbers may seem a little random at first, but the sequence says add the 2 numbers prior to the number, and you'll get that number. So 1 and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, 3 and 5 is 8, 5 and 8 is 13, 13 and 8 is 21. So if we would go to the next one, it would be 13 and 21 is 34. So as you get larger, the numbers gets larger exponentially a lot faster, right? You add up a lot quicker. And the concept around that is the bigger the story, the more complexities, the more uncertainties, and the more risks that are going to be around in completing that estimate in the kind of estimated or relative time frame that's being expected. So the numbers, like I mentioned, for the Fibonacci sequence are kind of abstract, but they're used to help provide some more details to the team as to what they can commit to for that sprint. So these numbers are called story points. It's how many points that story will need in order to be completed. As in a lot of the other techniques, any user stories that are larger really should be broken down. In this case, 13 and 21 for sure should be broken down into smaller user stories that can be estimated and put into smaller buckets, take less time to complete to deliver that value. As well, a lot of times the 8 is kind of looked at and determined, hey, can this be broken up at all? Because the smaller the stories are and the smaller story points are assigned, the easier that task is going to be completed, and the more likely you're going to be able to get it done within the estimated time frame that you're expecting. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about team velocity. But team velocities, by utilizing the Fibonacci sequence, we're able to understand what user stories we can likely get done in that sprint and have a better idea for that sprint and future sprints what we should be committing to.